So now that we've finished talking about the server side of our QuoteServices app case study, let's focus on the client side. So we're first going to start by giving an overview of the structure and the functionality of the client side classes. And this, of course, is going to focus on the parts here on the left, since we've already talked about the parts on the right. So the first class we're going to look at is called the QuoteClient class. And this class is used in conjunction with a bunch of other classes that work together with it, like the proxies and so on, to perform synchronous remote method invocations on the API gateway microservice in order to obtain the handy and zippy quotes. And here's what it looks like. We have this class, which is annotated as a component, so Spring can do auto detection and wiring. We then are going to auto wire the QuoteProxy, which we'll take a look at here in just a moment. And the methods that we have here are used to provide a nice high-level API for the test driver program to invoke to actually do the work under the hood, to make the calls to the appropriate microservice through the API gateway. So we have post quotes, which gets the list of quotes based on the quote IDs. And then we have search quotes, which is going to search for anything that happens to match in the queries against the quotes in either Zippy or Handy. So that's what QuoteClient does. Let's now take a look at the QuoteProxy. So this uses Retrofit. We talked about Retrofit earlier when I showed you how to use ChatGPT in order to generate this file. This file I wrote by hand, but you could certainly do it the way I showed you before. And this is going to create a proxy that will shield client programmers from the details of invoking remote methods via HTTP. So we don't have to write this code by hand. We can auto-generate it. And this is basically what it does. We're going to have these methods that are the proxy methods, which mimic the signature of the controller methods. This is what ChatGPT is so nice at doing. It's going to have each of these methods return something called a call object. And a call object is something that comes from Retrofit. It's actually a little bit wonky, especially compared to the Spring 6 HTTP interface clients feature, which doesn't require this, but hey, you get what you pay for. That's what you get with this. So these are call objects. We'll take a closer look at them shortly. And you can see that these call objects encapsulate the return types, which are lists of quotes in all these cases. And we'll walk through, when we look at the code, we'll take a closer look at the various annotations like get, and at post and how those are used. Let's now talk a bit about the proxy class. So this is kind of fun. This is going to use the auto-generated Retrofit API class, which is this quote API, to abstract the details of making remote method invocations using HTTP. So this is, again, code that we have to write. And you'll see why we do that in a second. We auto-wire the quote API to the QuoteProxy. Quote API, again, is something that's generated automatically by Retrofit. And here's how we connect it together. This uses a bean in, I think I now call this, I think I changed the name from components to client beans. This is going to be the bean that will make an instance of quote API. And you can see here's what it does. This is exactly what ChatGPT generated for us. It says, make me a new Retrofit object, associate it with the gateway base URL, make a converter factory that's the JSON converter factory. You can read about that here. Build it, and then connect everything together with the quote API, so it makes one of those things as the return value of the get quote API bean. Here's an example of how to do this. This is just one of the methods. This is post quotes. And you can see that post quotes is going to shield the client from the details of what we're passing. Here are the parameters we're passing. We're passing the string, which is the route, which is going to either be Handy or Zippy, which microservice we want to talk to, the list of quote IDs, and whether we want the calls to run in parallel or not. And those will be encoded and passed to the API gateway. And here's the actual call that's being made. We're calling post quotes on the quote API. Remember, this is all the code that's generated automatically by Retrofit. That's the parameters that we're passing in, no real surprise. This returns a call object, and then we're going to handle the call using this method. So here's the call utils class. That's where execute call comes from. And you can see here, this is just a helper class that defines a method that's used in conjunction with Retrofit, because this code is totally boilerplate. So here's what it looks like. We pass it the call object, and then we say invoke the call. So we use Retrofit to make the call. The call here is this thing. That's what we're calling that. And we execute that method, which makes the call over to the server. And then we're going to check to see what we got back. If we were successful, then the body of the response that came from executing the call is going to be returned. So we're just going to give back whatever we got. That's the happy path. However, if there was a problem, then we're going to figure out what went wrong, and we're going to throw an IO exception with that error message. So that's what happens if it doesn't succeed. That's the morose path. And then finally, just because I hate writing checked exception try catch blocks with a passion, I used this little exception util, exception laundering feature to take what would otherwise require checked exceptions and adapt it to throw runtime exceptions. So rethrow supplier will do all this stuff, and it'll throw the exception properly, but it doesn't require you to do try catch. So it's ever so much more succinct. So that's a walkthrough of the structure and the functionality of the client side classes.